Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon again. It's been a long day. Thanks for coming back. We're at the final keynote speech, and I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Torsten Reimer, who is on home turf, actually, because Torsten is the head of research services right here at the British Library, and so he's been doing two things today. He's been doing his proper job, and he's been popping in and out of sessions here as well. So I think that's the best of all the worlds. So I think Torsten is more than able to introduce his own subject. So I'll just hand right over to you, Torsten.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's quite nice to be able to pop in and out, although on occasion you don't get this email like, can you just really urgently come to the office? There's something urgent, but we'll only take a couple of minutes. And that's very rarely the case when it's urgent. But I had the chance to see quite a few of the talks today. And obviously a lot was about challenges and problems. I would love to come here and say I have all the answers. Instead, I'll give you a few more problems, or at least maybe slightly different perspective on some of the challenges from the sort of point of view of the National Library. But I'll maybe not quite answers, but I'll also in the second part of the talk want to say a little bit about what we are doing to tackle some of these challenges. I have the pleasure of looking after one of the sort of 5 strategic change management portfolios at the British Library. It's called Everything Available. That's a great title, but it's also quite difficult to talk about because inevitably people will ask you, can you define everything? And what do you mean by available? And I'll try to sort of cover that, but I'll sort of, as I said, approach it a bit from what are some of the challenges that we currently see, and maybe also a bit of a personal perspective on a few problems or issues in the wider library information management world. The first question that we have to ask ourselves is really sort of why are we actually here as librarians, or as publishers, or as technology providers? For a librarian, the default answer seems to be that you have to shush people in reading rooms. At least that's sort of what some of my relatives thought when I took over this job, and then I told them that I have very little to do with books. I mean, I have some things to do with books, but it's not the main thing. I think broadly speaking, what we are here for, and I think I'm hoping goes for pretty much everyone in this audience, we want to help people to find, hopefully, some relevant information, then give them access to it, maybe support them in using that information, and in the end, when they've created some new knowledge, we also want to be able to help them to share that, and then sort of the cycle starts all over again. And I think that's a bit more than just a job. I would argue it's actually fairly broad responsibility for society, because in the end, progress, and in some areas, lives depend on that information being shared and getting into the right hands. So I think it's a fun and exciting thing to do, but it also has a sort of serious side to it. And therefore, I think what we need to do when we're not busy shushing people is think about, are we actually doing what we've been asked to? And sort of, it's been asked before, are there maybe areas where we failed our users in what we're undertaking? And you can come at this from different perspectives, but I've sort of seen a little tweet recently from an academic who said he's regularly using Sci-Hub when he's not on site, even when it's getting access to material that his institution is subscribed to. And the reason he's doing it is effectively because the user experience is better. You can just go straight there, click, download, get the article. I mean, you've all heard about or experienced the challenges that we face. And from that point of view, I would argue, this is, I mean, obviously anecdotal, but we know there's quite a lot of use of Sci-Hub. We also know that Sci-Hub now holds close to 100% of the journal content that academics would like to find. If you want to read a bit more about this, Universities UK have published a report at the end of last year looking at transition to open access, and they've also looked at different sources where you can get content from. And ResearchGate is a bit behind Sci-Hub, but at least at the end of last year, you could still get lots of material, and most of it, you'd argue how far it's legal, and there are, of course, other platforms. And this really can't be in the interest of any stakeholder in this environment. I mean, regardless of whether you're a publisher and you're interested in staying in business, or whether you're a university or a national library, And in particular, I think what can also be in our interest is if you look at the hashtag, the academic has tagged this with open science. And I don't know about you, but my view of open science is not going to an illegal website that's hosted somewhere where it's not possible to take it down and download material that's got there illegally. That can't be the right way to open up science. But interestingly, at least from that personal perspective, that's how this academic has seen it and how he sort of chose to articulate it. And from that point of view, I'd say you can ask about financial models and all, but certainly on the user experience, I would argue we are failing our users because it's too complicated. And in those cases, they wouldn't go to Sci-Hub if publishers and libraries together and other information providers were able to give them the content in as easy a way as possible. Now, obviously, we're facing this challenge, but we're not alone. Other industries have had somewhat similar challenges, I would argue. And best example is the music industry. I remember Napster when it was still illegal. But it was terribly exciting in the sense you could hear something on the radio. You could just write a few lines of text down of a song which you had no idea what it was. And it might then maybe take half an hour or 5 minutes, depending on how quick your internet connection was, but you could then get the song. And that was a fantastic thing that for people who like music and like discovering music has changed a lot. And there was lots of concern, obviously, in the music industry. Is this going to be our end as a viable industry? But we're now at the point when you look at teenagers, I mean, they might not necessarily use the commercial version of Napster now. They probably have some other subscription service. And the idea that you'd actually go somewhere and download individual songs is probably fairly foreign to quite a few teenagers because you just pay 10 quid or whatever it might be, and you just have sort of everything on whichever device you want, and it's there and it's ready. So arguably, I don't want to say this model can easily be transferred into scholarly information, but there are industries where they actually have managed to, partly by legal means and shutting down Napster and other activities, but in the end, really, by giving people the kind of user experience they were looking for at a price they were willing and able to pay. And I think it would be fantastic if, at some point, for scholarly information, we could get there, where it's as easy and it's as widely used, and we can make sure that hopefully almost everyone, or everyone ideally, can get access to information. Now, interestingly, if you look at another trend, open access, that's part of a movement that wants to achieve doing this. And interestingly, it's not going to happen today, but certainly if you look at governments and funding bodies, you would assume at some point we'll get to a point where certainly scholarly articles, at some point also monographs and other materials will be available freely online. We can argue how long that's going to take, what business model it is, but that's certainly the strong drive that research funding bodies and governments give us, and at least they make some money available. In the UK, we now recently reached the tipping point where if you're prepared to wait a little bit, you could get more than 50% of scholarly articles open access, and obviously that means in an open access world, there is no requirement for access and authentication. I mean, you might need it for specific other purposes, but simply for getting people access to content, you don't need to know who they are because you can just give it to everyone. So you could say, well, possibly one solution for access and identity management, at least for access to content in the scholarly environment, could come from the open access world. And the problem is, though, we're not there yet. Some people might argue we will perhaps never get there, so we still have to deal with the difficulty of what do we do until this brave new world has arrived. But certainly one thing I find quite important from the perspective of a national library is to think a little bit about what challenges would we face in an open access world. And I mean, one very clear challenge is discovery. With more and more stuff being published online in open access, it can end up pretty much anywhere, and some ends up almost anywhere. Helping people find the right version then is sort of another challenge that you could say currently you go to your library catalog or use Google Scholar and you might sort of get through to some content, but in particular, if you think about data publishing and all these sort of slightly unusual things for which we don't currently have discovery infrastructures, I think while we are thinking about how we can improve current access and authentication, we should also think quite a lot about what can we do for improving discovery. Monographs is one example, but even for non-open access monographs, it's often difficult to find things in the way you want. And another challenge that we'll have in an open access world is preservation, because if your content can go anywhere and anyone can sort of copy it anywhere, how much confidence can you have that the version you're citing, which may or may not be the version on the publisher's website, will still be there in 5 months, or from the perspective of a national library, 500 years? At this point, probably very little confidence, but I think it's certainly a challenge that we need to think about. So I think we'll not be out of problems and interesting issues to solve, even if we didn't need access management for open access content more broadly. On the discovery part, I think from a library perspective, it's quite interesting that arguably becoming increasingly less relevant. This is, and I appreciate you can't read the detail, but this is a study that JISC and the British Library funded in 2012, and that looked at discovery habits of early career researchers and PhD students. And one of the smallest bars here is the cross-institutional library catalog or the institutional library one. The biggest one at that time was Google Scholar, although there are various other approaches like citation databases and e-journals and the like. I would assume if we did the same thing now, Google Scholar would probably have increased and quite a few of the other areas would have gone down. Now, I mean, you can say, well, fair enough, if people use Google Scholar to find content, that's fine. But from a library's perspective, I think it should all give us food for thought, because if at some point users don't need us anymore for discovery of content, and we don't buy subscription anymore, and we don't need to manage the access and identity management infrastructure, what are we still here for? Will people still need us? Or in a more positive way, where can we add value? And I think in particular from the perspective of a national library, that's an important question and something that I'm thinking a lot about in terms of what can we usefully do, thinking that at some point we will be in this sort of brave new open access world. So there are a few factors. I've sort of just picked a few out here that I think affect the library environment more broadly. I think the biggest challenge in a way is the first one, and that's our researchers increasingly work in a digital way, and they have expectations, such as you just go somewhere, you type something in, you press a button, you get what you want, because that's, say, what students are now used to. And we already struggle making that first step with our users, but then if you think how much computational research is now done, what new outputs people create, and how we can manage all of those, keep them available, it's a fairly broad challenge that libraries are facing in that space. A couple of years ago, the Software Sustainability Institute in the UK did a survey amongst researchers in the Russell Group, and 69% of them said they can't do their research anymore without dedicated research software. So if we want to be able to feed our outputs into what they are doing and take their outputs and do something with them, as libraries, as publishers, we need to be able to interface much more with software. And that's already difficult enough because you need to interface with the people as well. So it just makes these challenges bigger. Some of the other problems I think I've mentioned. From the perspective of a national library, our budget is at best stable. With general inflation and cost of subscriptions, we are increasingly struggling to subscribe to content as broadly as our users want, at least to buy things broadly. Although even then, our collections are still growing at quite a good pace. We get about 3 million items into our collections every year. So you could just say, well, through legal deposit and other material, we get enough content anyway. But if you look at how rapidly content is increasing on the internet, not just content that's published in traditional ways, but just look at research data, then our own collections will increasingly become less relevant simply because there's just much more stuff available outside. And what we need to think about is how we can help our users to get to that content. In some cases, that requires some form of payment or access and identity management. In other cases, it links to these challenges that I've mentioned before around discovery in particular. How are we tackling this? And here we're coming to everything available. How we're tackling this at the British Library. The library has an overarching vision that's meant to take us from 2015, when it was set up, to 2023. This is, for those of you who wonder why such an odd date, it's the date when we will celebrate our 50th anniversary as an independent organization. Some of you may know that we were the Library of the British Museum before becoming an own organization. And Living Knowledge basically says that we want to be the most open and innovative institution of our kind. You can argue maybe what that sort of includes and doesn't include. But I think open, creative, and innovative are the key words, really. And that's quite a challenge, in particular when there are lots of issues and your budget is shrinking. So we've decided to tackle this by setting up a change management portfolio called Everything Available, and a new department, which I'm heading. It's called Research Services. And what we're looking at is sort of working across the library and with partners externally to think about how can we improve the services to our researchers, but also services that we offer to other research organizations, and what can we maybe do working with partners on a global scale to improve the overall environment. And we now have a sort of draft strategy. It's not quite ready to be published external, but I'll say a little bit about what's in there, how we are going to tackle this. And then we'll use the Everything Available portfolio to either get people to ask me questions about defining everything, or to hopefully deliver quite a few of these activities. I think at the heart of the strategy is what I mentioned earlier. In the not quite so olden days, from a British Library perspective, you could say, well, we sort of have probably almost everything that researchers might want when they come to us. And there's some other stuff, but they'll sort of get it through other means, and lots of it will be available in not electronic form, so they'll have to go somewhere else anyway. We obviously get, in theory at least, a copy of everything that's published in the UK. It's not quite 100%, but it's a very good turnout. And we also have a relatively large budget for subscribing to scholarly content, although that is shrinking. And what we're now, I think, facing and moving towards is a world where it's a bit more complicated. But we still have terrific collections, and they'll still grow, but everything else around them will grow much further. We therefore need to improve the way how we help get our users access. There might be some content where we can actually give them remote access. The library hasn't done this very much because it's partly been difficult negotiating deals with publishers, because if you're a national library and everyone can register, then the first question you get from the rights holders, if we give you remote access, will not every university in the country cancel its subscriptions and they'll all come to you? I mean, if you work in a university, I think the idea that Oxford would cancel all its subscriptions and tell everyone to come to the British Library is not very likely. But I can see why publishers are asking that question, although we have recently been able to negotiate more remote access, and I think for our users, that's very good, because some of our users are not served by anyone else and they can't often travel to a British Library in person. But even so, we also have content that you will only be able to access on site. We get a lot of material from publishers in the UK through legal deposit electronically, and we can only make this available in the same way as we would do with legal deposit books, which is on site. So we also need to be able to provide that content. And then obviously there's a whole world of open access content around us, and that's going to grow even further. And that's perhaps, for some of you might say, well, that's not a very radical rethink. On the other hand, if you are, say, a more traditional curator and you mostly focused on our own collections, this brings up a whole lot of questions about what is a collection, how do you give someone access to, and what do you do with all this content that someone else has out there that you have no control over, but that people come to you and say, I want this content, can you help us? Or rather, I have a question, how do I find the best answer to all of this? Which brings us to the strategy, and I think my sort of key response, and until it's been officially approved, let's just say this is my personal view at this point. The best thing we can do is work together with other stakeholders on setting up or improving a global knowledge environment that's sustainable, because in the end, content will always be distributed around, and we have to work together to make it more useful. So this could, for example, mean if lots of people create content that we can't buy or even don't need to buy, but that's difficult to discover, can we work with other organizations and, for example, give them persistent identifiers for their content? We're already doing this at the British Library. We're running a service called DataSite for the UK, where data centers and universities can get DOIs for data sets, software, and other outputs that they publish. But I think there's a lot more work that we can do, and it's partly sort of the realization that if you want to make sure that our users can actually get useful content, perhaps we have a role in working with other organizations, for example, setting up better approaches to preservation of research data, or looking at, say, working with open access publishing infrastructures, I would say, that maybe aren't publishers, that might not necessarily have a preservation service. But interestingly, as you probably know, also not all publishers are currently set up for doing digital preservation. So it's partly, I think, a shift where instead of exclusively curating our collections, I think we should work with other organizations with the expertise we've developed in that space to maybe help them make their collections more accessible and also provide some support in managing it. We'll do a few other things. One is that we'll, in some areas, have to shift away from just buying everything just in case someone might want it to only buying things just in time when someone actually wants it, because we just can't afford buying this anymore. And again, you need a good, easy workflow where it doesn't take hours until someone gets the content, but where ideally we can just procure content from publishers almost instantly, so that the users don't even realize that we haven't had this. They just click somewhere and it appears, and we pay the appropriate fee, and everyone's happy. What we also, I think, need to do is moving away from giving our users access to documents and rather try and point them to specific information, because there is now so much being published. I mean, it's often been talked about. We have 150 million items in our catalog, so if you look for something, there's a good chance we'll have way more here than you can read. Some of it might not be the most cutting edge. And instead of giving people a list with 700, or if you're Google, 2 million hits, wouldn't it be nice to say, actually, this particular problem that you're looking after, here is a paragraph in an article that has an answer. And by the way, this is linking to a data set that sits in the repository of Oxford University, and you can just click here, and then you can get access to the data. So what we're going to do is look much more into technologies like text and data mining to really be able to serve information instead of just buckets of content to our users. So these are sort of some of the elements of the strategy. And the key part in all of this, as I said, is making our own collections more discoverable, but also working with other organizations to help them do that. And we're quite lucky in the sense that some of you may have seen this when you've been looking around in the building. We are hosting the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Centre for Data Science. They've moved in with us. They are separate organizations, but we are hosting them. And we spent quite a lot of time talking to them, and hopefully this will, over time, lead to some more exciting collaborations in really digging down into larger or complex, smaller data sets and content. And as I said before, significant part is through persistent identifiers and others, help others to make their content available in a way that it's easier to find and easier to extract useful information from it. This is sort of what I'm hoping we'll get to eventually for a kind of workflow to get content to our users. This will not be, I think, at least for quite a while, a single workflow from the library's perspective. There will be different things behind powering it, but hopefully it will be from a user's perspective, where I would quite like to have a bit of an internal logic when someone wants a piece of content, and we can then say, okay, is this content open access? In which case, we'll just give you a link, and wherever you are, you can get the version that gives you the content to read, but also reuse rights. If we can't find an open access version for you, maybe there's something that's free to read online, so you might not be able to share it or work with it in the way you want, but you can still get it freely online. If we can't find that version either, maybe we are subscribed to that content and we have a license to serve it to you remotely. That still, from a user's perspective, doesn't make that much difference. Now, there's a possibility we don't have it because we have digital content, but we can't make it available remotely, in which case we can at least tell someone, if you want the digital version, please then come into our building and we can give it to you. Then there's the possibility, if we don't have a digital version, we might then be able to say, well, we could give you content that we have in print if you want. Or it's possible that we can buy the content somewhere for the user. It brings up the question, of course, will we have the budget to meet all these requirements? If we don't have the budget, then would it be a useful thing for us to broker some discounts for users? Would our users be confused because we are suddenly looking like a commercial entity? This is not necessarily something we are going to do. It's just, I think, a question I would like to raise. There may be some other paid-for option where we can just tell our users, well, we don't have this, but there might be a way, and we can't buy it for you, but there might be a way where you could buy it. Or we can say, we have a print-only copy, But if you want, we can digitize it and send it to you. And then the point that we hopefully very rarely get to is that we can say, sorry, we just can't help you. And this is sort of what I'm hoping we can at least make good progress to, that from a user's perspective, this should be quite transparent. When you're here in the building, we might maybe give you some different versions of content than when you are outside of the building, but make that process as smoothly as possible. And there are obviously still quite a few aspects in there for which we will need to know who the users are, because, say, a publisher might say, we are quite happy for you to give all our users remote access, but we don't want you to do this for people who work at a UK higher education institution, because they should buy their own license. I mean, this is just an example, but there could be different restrictions from rights holders. And these cases need to be confident that we can identify where our users are, what these users might want from us, but also what the rights holder allows us to do, so that we can match this in a way that the users have the least possible hassle, that we meet all the legal requirements, and hopefully can do all of this in a not overly costly way. All of that will be sort of successful if we don't get the initial challenge right, which is user experience. We started thinking about this much more actively last year when we contracted a company called Bunnyfoot. Even though it has a much longer title, we internally only refer to it as the Bunnyfoot study, because it's normally the only thing that colleagues can remember about it. But we brought them in to say, can you tell us what's the discovery experience for our users? How easy is it to discover and then retrieve something? And how do we compare to similar organizations? And they looked at other organizations and compared our website. They did their own usability testing of what we do, and they did some contextual research that included walking alongside with people who come here for the first time and register in the library until they sit in the reading room, or sitting people in front of a computer and tell them, the British Library has some content that you want, how do you find it? And that was quite eye-opening. I mean, perhaps not a surprise for some colleagues who've been here for quite a while, but we got a long list of questions and concerns, and the biggest thing is our users don't understand why we don't search like Google. I think that's the biggest issue, and we've put quite a lot of effort into allow various filters in our discovery solution. Most users don't use them. They just type something in. If they don't find something, they type something else in. If they still don't find it, they're gone because they assume we don't have it. So that was a very clear steer, but also I think, like some other libraries, we have a few systems. And in fact, we have quite a lot more because our collections are quite complex. So different subcatalogs for particular areas, this is all very confusing to our users. And at the end, doing this study, this was a relatively small-scale study. We ended up with 63 recommendations to implement. Some of them with a time horizon where we expect it will take us maybe 3 to 5 years to tackle it, because we'll basically have to replace our whole catalog discovery infrastructure and touch every single system to do it, which helpfully we decided to do anyway, but this has sort of given us a clear steer on how we can best set up these systems. So partly in response to this, I've then set up a user experience design post in my department. This is sort of the first one that we have that specifically looks after the user experience for researchers on-site and online, with a desire to bring this together. And from now on, basically, every new thing that we'll roll out, user experience design, testing, and stronger focus on working with actual users in the design will be built into new services that we are looking at. So to wrap up, the key thing I think in all of this is not necessarily how much content we'll have, but will we give our users the kind of experience that they're looking for, because in an online world they can just go somewhere else. And I'd rather not have them go to illegal websites where you're not quite sure what exactly you're getting from, and where the universities have lots of problems with their staff being encouraged to give their credentials to another organization who will then use it to mine content, which the university IT directors, I can assure you, having come here from a university a good year ago, are not very happy about. And I think as a sector, if we don't tackle the user experience and find better ways of getting content, then to an extent we've failed, and the likes of Sci-Hub will not go away until we really rise to that challenge. And that's only something that we'll really tackle by different stakeholders working together, because no one can get that user experience right. And I'd argue that we have, as I've said earlier, a broader responsibility for society to get this right. Thank you.